Welcome to the Department of Housing Stability's Mandatory Affordable Housing Training. This training will help you understand the eligibility requirements, income verification process, and required documentation for the host Mandatory Affordable Housing Program. Upon completing this training, you will have knowledge of the covenant, the income eligibility requirements, rent limits, the utility allowance and non-optional fees, rent calculations, the initial qualification and initial renewal process, over-income households, income and asset verifications, income calculations, compliance reporting, and required documentation. Let's start by talking about the covenant. The covenant is intended to secure the affordability of designated units. A covenant is required prior to the issuance of a temporary certificate of occupancy, also referred to as a TCO, or certificate of occupancy. The covenant is an agreement between the owner or developer and the City and County of Denver to provide affordable housing units as per the rules and regulations of the Mandatory Affordable Housing Ordinance, codified at Article 10, Chapter 27 of the Denver Revised Municipal Code. Additionally, these rules and regulations supersede and replace the Affordable Housing Permanent Funds Ordinance, also referred to as the Housing Fund Ordinance, codified at Article 5, Chapter 27 of the Denver Revised Municipal Code. The Rental and Occupancy Covenant will provide you with a number of income-restricted units, the rent and income limitations, the compliance and reporting requirements, as well as the period of affordability. To be eligible to lease an income-restricted unit, or IRU, a household must earn no more than the designated AMI, and that's based on the household size. A household size is the total number of people occupying the unit. Only persons on the lease as an occupant can be counted as a household member, and that does include minors. All households must be income verified by the property manager or owner prior to leasing an income-restricted unit. Income verification is required prior to move-in and prior to lease renewal. Income limits are updated annually and can be found on our website using the link to the left. Rent requirements. The maximum gross rent is based on the size of the unit. It includes the total a household pays for rent, plus their utility allowance and non-optional fees. The maximum allowable rent is the amount of rent charged to the household after the utility allowance and non-optional fees are deducted from the maximum gross rent. Rents cannot exceed the maximum gross rent for the designated AMI. However, rents can be lower than the designated AMI. Rent concessions and leasing specials can be offered on income-restricted units. Rent limits are updated annually and can be found on our website using the link below. The host mandatory affordable housing program compliance will follow similar rules of Section 42 LIHTC compliance, with some exceptions. For example, the student rule. There is no student rule. There are no restrictions on student eligibility. Non-optional fees. Host non-optional fees vary from those under Section 42, Low-Income Housing Tax Credit or LIHTC program. Our excluded fees for the host income restricted units include administrative fees, non-refundable holding fee, a month-to-month lease fee, the unit transfer fee, an application fee must not exceed the cost billed to the property for rental, credit, and background history, third-party income verification fees, as well as common area maintenance or CAM fees. What are non-optional fees? Non-optional fees are the costs that a resident is required to pay as a condition of occupancy. Non-optional fees can be billed to host income-restricted units. However, The fees must be deducted from the maximum gross rent. Some examples of non-optional fees include the mandatory renter's insurance or liability insurance, fees to make rent payments electronically or online, amenity fees, parking and garage fees, and utility service fees. What is a utility allowance? A utility allowance helps the household afford the cost of utilities. If utilities are not included in the rent, but are paid by the resident, a utility allowance must be subtracted from the maximum gross rent. Some allowable utilities include electricity, gas, oil, or propane, water, sewer, and trash, and utility service fees. Please keep in mind a utility allowance is not a stipend. It is a required deduction in the maximum gross rent and is based on the size of the unit. Here we have the HUD utility schedule model. The HUD utility schedule model is most often used to determine the utility allowance per bedroom size. This utility schedule is published annually by DOLA and is available on our website. Use of other means of calculating utility costs may be allowed, but must be approved by host prior to implementation. Here is an example on how to calculate maximum allowable rent. In this example, we're needing to determine the rent limit for a one bedroom at 80% AMI. According to the graph here, 80% AMI, a one bedroom is priced at $2,102. To determine the utility allowance, we'd refer back to the HUD schedule model, one bedroom, and go down the list of the different types of utility fuel sources. For example, heating at natural gas is $23. Cooking, that is electric, is $7. Other electric, as in the other electric for that property, is $26. Water heating, natural gas is $6. Water is $29. Sewer, $37. Trash is $34. And then this property charges non-optional fees, which includes an amenity fee of $20 and renter's insurance at $12. We would need to add all of the utility allowance and optional fees together, and this amount will be deducted from the maximum gross rent. The total here is $194. So we will then take the maximum gross rent of the $2,102 and subtract the utility allowance and non-optional fees of $194 to get a maximum allowable rent of $1,908. This is the maximum allowable monthly rent that can be billed to the resident in this one bedroom income restricted unit. When calculating new rents, it is important that new rent and income limits are released. The property has 60 days to implement the new rents and income limits for all lease renewals and new move-ins. HERA limits do not apply here. The Utility Allowance Schedule Model is released by the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, or DOLA, annually. New utility allowances must be implemented within 90 days of their release for all lease renewals and new move-ins. All non-optional fees and utility allowance must be deducted from the maximum gross rent. Please note, record of the utility allowance and non-optional fees must be kept in the resident file for host review and reporting. Initial qualification and initial lease renewal. During an initial qualification or move-in, every household must be income qualified prior to moving into an income restricted unit. Prospective tenants of an income restricted unit must complete an application and host certification questionnaire. They must also meet the property's resident selection criteria requirements. They must provide verification of income showing that their household income is at or below the designated AMI. They must also provide asset verification if their combined household assets are above 100,000. They are also required to complete the host resident income certification, also referred to as the RIC, and the Affordable Housing Lease Addendum, as well as the VAWA Addendum at lease signing. At their initial lease renewal, every household and an income restricted unit must verify their income prior to signing a lease renewal. They must complete a host certification questionnaire at least 60 days prior to lease expiration date. They must provide verification of income showing that their household income is at or below 140% of the current designated AMI for the tenant's household size. They must also provide asset verification if their combined household assets are above 100,000. Lastly, they must complete the host resident income certification, also referred to as the RIC, the Affordable Housing Lease Addendum, and the VAWA Addendum at lease signing. All lease renewals after the initial lease renewal will be self-certifications, meaning that they will only be required to complete the host certification questionnaire, the RIC, and the Affordable Housing Lease Addendum. Their income and asset verification documentation is not required. For over-income households, if a household income is above the designated AMI at the time of application, the household is considered over income and does not qualify to lease an income restricted unit. If a household's income was at or below the designated AMI at move-in, but is above 140% of the current designated AMI at lease renewal, the house is no longer eligible to lease an income restricted unit. The household is not required to move out of the unit. However, they are now required to pay market rent at lease renewal, and the unit is no longer counted as an income restricted unit. Please keep in mind that rents can only be increased once within a 12-month period. To calculate 140% of designated AMI, take the current designated AMI based on the number of people in the household and multiply it by 140%. For example, a two-person household at 80% AMI in Denver as of June 2025 has an income limit of $89,680. We'll multiply that by 140% to get a total of $125,552. If the household's income is above $125,552, they are no longer eligible to lease a host income restricted unit. To replace the over income household, lease the next unit with the same number of bedrooms, comparable amenities, and square footage to the next eligible applicant. The new applicant must meet all initial qualification requirements. Over-income households and existing households. The income restricted units are floating units, meaning that they can be changed when a household no longer qualifies for the income restricted unit. If a household income exceeds 140% of the current designated AMI at lease renewal, the income restricted unit can be reassigned to a household currently living on the property that meets the income qualification for the income restricted unit. After their income is verified, complete all the required host income restricted documentation and execute a lease modification reflecting the new income restricted rent. When reassigning the income restricted unit to a household currently living on the property, keep in mind that the unit must be comparable to the unit being exchanged, same number of bedrooms, and comparable amenities and square footage. Just a helpful hint, it would be a good idea to keep a list of all existing residents that would be interested in an income restricted unit. And you'll want to maintain this list by the date a household expressed interest in an income restricted unit. At the first lease renewal, you'll want to keep in mind that residents will have a full certification, but only for the first year. This allows for the review of the information from move-in to be compared against current information. During this first renewal, you'll want to notify the resident at least 60 days prior to their lease end date that their lease is soon to expire and that it is time to determine their eligibility for the host affordable housing program. Include the host certification questionnaire with this notice. You'll provide a deadline to return the completed host certification questionnaire and all required income verification documentation. You'll also review that documentation timely, no later than 45 days from the lease end date, to determine the household's eligibility and to notify the household of their eligibility and rental rate. If the household is income eligible, complete the resident income certification, the affordable housing lease addendum, and VAWA at lease signing. If the household income exceeds 140% of the current designated AMI, notify the resident that they no longer qualify. Be prepared to show how their income was determined and provide at least a 30-day notice of the new rental rate. Verifications. Verification of employment. To verify employment, an independent third-party system like the Work Number can be used. However, a household cannot be charged for these services, or a minimum of 2 current and consecutive pay stubs, or a payroll summary report. Their new hire pay stub or their first pay stub is not accepted. An employer hire letter for new employment can also be used, as well as a verification of employment form that is emailed or faxed directly to the employer. For Social Security, pension, or military income, the applicant or resident can provide their award letter. The income verification for these sources of income must specify that it is income for the current year. For example, if the applicant or resident is applying in 2025, the award letter should either be dated 2025 or reference the payment amount for 2025. For other sources of income, if the household receives child support, alimony, old age pension, TANF, or aid to needy families, the household can provide a printout of their account showing monthly payments or payment history. If an applicant or resident is unemployed, complete the host unemployment affidavit and provide verification of unemployment benefits if they are being received. If the household receives financial assistance on a regular basis from someone living outside of the household, such as a friend or family member, have the person providing the assistance complete the host gift affidavit. This gifted financial assistance is counted as income. Basic allowance for housing must also be counted as income. Verification documentation. There is no limit to the amount of assets a household may have. If the household has combined assets exceeding $100,000, asset verification is required. To verify assets, obtain the most recent statement for each asset or account. Only one statement per account is required. Screenshots are not permitted. Required resident file documents include the host certification questionnaire, the resident income certification form or RIC, the income calculation worksheet, an income verification document or documents, asset verification documentation if assets are over $100,000, the Affordable Housing Lease Addendum, the Violence Against Women's Act or VAWA Addendum, a copy of the resident lease agreement, the utility allowance schedule, and their move-in inspection. The host certification questionnaire must be completed and signed by all adult household members in an income restricted unit prior to move-in and prior to lease renewal. Demographic information can be provided at the time of move-in. While it is optional, we encourage households to provide this information as we strive to ensure that we are serving a diverse community. The Resident Income Certification Form, also referred to as the RIC, is a required host form and must be signed by all adult household members in an income restricted unit with the lease agreement at move-in and at lease renewal. Here is an example of the host calculation worksheet. You're welcome to use our calculation worksheet or provide one of your own. The affordable housing lease addendum is required at move-in and at each lease renewal. It must be signed by all adult household members. The affordable housing lease addendum prohibits the following lease provisions: agreement to be sued, possession of a resident property as rent payment, excusing owner from responsibility, waiver of notice, waiver of legal proceedings, waiver of a jury trial, waiver of right to appeal court decisions. It makes tenant chargeable with cost of legal actions regardless of outcome, or termination of tenancy without good cause. Those are all prohibitions with the Affordable Housing List Addendum. The Affordable Housing Lease Addendum does require residents to provide accurate information regarding family income, family composition, and other eligibility requirements. It also requires them to annually provide source documentation verifying their family income and assets. However, with our program, it's only required at initial lease renewal unless additional verification is needed. It also requires the residents to provide access to their unit for an annual housing quality standards inspection. The Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA. On March 7, 2013, the Violence Against Women's Reauthorization Act of 2013, or VAWA, was signed into law. The law significantly expanded housing protections of victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The law was reauthorized in 2022, increasing grants and fundings for assistance. Initial lease-up is the period beginning the date a temporary certificate of occupancy, or TCO, or certificate of occupancy is issued, and it ends on the date all income restricted units are leased, or 6 months from the date the TCO is issued, whichever happens first. The owner or property manager must notify host asset management when all income restricted units are leased. After lease up, annual reporting is required. Annual reporting is due on the anniversary of the initial lease up date. Listed are the required reporting documents: the Affordable Rental Compliance Report, the Resident Income Certification, or RIC, the Host Certification Questionnaire, Income Calculation Worksheet, the Income Verification Documents, Asset Verification Documents if the assets for the household exceed $100,000, the Affordable Housing Lease Addendum, the Violence Against Women's Act Addendum, the copy of Resident Lease Agreement, a rent roll or similar report, the Utility Allowance Schedule, the resident selection criteria for your property, and their initial move-in inspection report. The Affordable Rental Compliance Report is a required host form. It must be submitted with the income verification documents of each household that moved in or renewed a lease within the reporting period. The Affordable Rental Compliance Report is due at the end of lease up when all income restricted units are leased, or 6 months after TCO or CO is issued, whichever happens first. Host income restricted units will be inspected by host inspections prior to TCO or CO. Inspections will be scheduled by the assigned host asset manager. Host income restricted units may be inspected annually during the term of the covenant. Host will always notify management prior to inspections. Properties not in compliance may be required to complete more frequent reporting until the units are brought into compliance. Have a site visit scheduled by the asset and compliance team to review procedures and file compliance, or pay civil penalties and fines per unit out of compliance. During initial leasing and during the term of the covenant, owners and/or management must make a good faith effort to market income restricted units to eligible households. Please refer to the host equitable fair marketing policies and procedures. Properties with income restricted units must be advertised on coloradohousingsearch.com. coloradohousingsearch.com provides a list of affordable housing rental and affordable for sale units. It's free and easy to list. Host affordable units should be marketed as income restricted. Properties located in an area vulnerable to displacement or containing a minimum of 100 dwelling units may also be subject to the prioritization program described in Article 12, Chapter 27 of the DRMC. For information about the prioritization program, contact Host Prioritization at denvergov.org. Please see a list of our host compliant and asset management contacts. For general inquiries, please contact Host Compliance at hostrentalcompliance at denvergov.org. Thank you so much for your time and attention to today's training.